Hey guys, it's Nick. If you're looking to level up your security and compliance, stay tuned because in this video, I'm going to share some resources that I built that not only allows you to perform an assessment of how you stack up against the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, but it also includes the framework mappings to recommended Microsoft security controls and then bundles that into a Power BI template. It's actually multi-tenant capable to actually track your compliance goals and implementation of security across all of your customers. So stay tuned, we'll be going through all of that and I'll be handing you over those resources at the end of the call. But as always, if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space, be sure to subscribe. Okay, so before I get into the tool set here, I quickly want to touch on some of the gaps that I see in talking with a lot of MSPs about their existing cybersecurity practices or security compliance as a whole. What I see fundamentally we do well is these checklists, which is basically to say we have an SOP or a certain level of a list that we follow when we onboard a client to greenlight certain policies and settings. And we see that heavily with Microsoft 365, something you've probably been doing for years. And from there, you might be using the secure score recommendations to just keep monitoring different policies that you could implement. But the biggest gap that I see is there's a lack of understanding the why behind why we are implementing those policies and what type of holistic coverage it's giving us as it relates to our cybersecurity footprint and coverage when we talk about the threat landscape as it exists today. And the other big gap that I see is there's no policy definition. So there's no framework, there's no North Star to really follow to say this is the golden standard of how we do this in our MSP. And we want to extend that out to our customers as best we can. Given that there's a lot of uniqueness, we have to make deviations, but that's something that we can kind of overcome by having these policy definitions in place, something for the entire organization as far as your MSP can follow when you onboard new customers and then formally review that over time. And from the framework perspective, some of us are beginning to adopt more of this as well, like CIS or such as NIST that we'll be talking about today. But I see that as a gap as well too. You may have what you believe is a good security practice, but it doesn't really follow any standard. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And in doing so, when we talk about not having this North Star or not having documented policy definitions, your security often becomes very ad hoc or reactive, and it's very inconsistent definitions that you have across your customers. I bet if I ask you today, do you know if you implement XYZ policy across all customers? You might say yes, but you might not have that documented anywhere in your MSP. You might say, I don't know, because we don't do that, in a consistent way today as well. And the basic summary here on the right-hand side is that a checklist does not equal compliance. You really want to update and mature in an area where you have this framework, this North Star, and these policy definitions to guide the controls that you put into place and the priority that you put in implementing those controls as well. So if you're an MSP out there today, these are some basic questions you can begin to ask yourself to understand your maturity level in this area. But in a lot of cases, none of us are following this framework or standard because we don't have to meet regulatory compliance today as an MSP. And we need to have that framework to follow to be able to give us certain levels of structure that allow us to get organization, but also allow us to stack up and rank goals that we have, which we'll get into later. Also, the lack of policy definitions, when we think about that, are they written? Not in a lot of cases, they're not. And are they implemented in our customer base as well too, such as an incident response plan, vulnerability management plan, backup and disaster recovery, but also on a very basic layer when we think about how we manage devices in our organization. Is that defined as far as their life cycle goes? In a lot of cases, that's just known, but not necessarily followed and reviewed on a periodic basis. And then this is what I came back to before, but if we do have those policy definitions in place, kind of have our standard as an MSP, and we try to stick to that standard for all of the clients that we onboard into our ecosystem. But obviously, there's always going to be uniqueness in customer environments where we have deviations, and that's where we can modify them slightly, but try to get them as close as we can to what our policy definitions are. So not only do we increase our cybersecurity, but we also reduce our operational overhead from the variance in customers, and that allows us to not only for our security security teams, our service teams, to be a little bit more efficient in managing those customers as well. The formal review process is often a time constraint for a lot of us as well too, when we think about reviewing the policies we have into place and controls. And in the Microsoft realm, this comes up heavily when we talk about the concept of drift, where our policies have moved away from what we would consider to be quote unquote compliant. And then the last one is all about goal setting. So do you have a way today to measure where you're at as far as a standard goes, a baseline, and then set goals for the future? If we talk about this as a concept, this is a marathon, not a sprint. We talk about cybersecurity, and you're always going to be in that continuous improvement mindset. You should be, at least, because we're never going to be perfect, but we can always level up in certain areas given the amount of time and resources that we have as well. So lastly here, when we talk about NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, they've recently come out with the official publication. It was in a draft stage for many months. I've been talking about this for months personally on my blog and videos as well, but many businesses have been using this to reduce their cybersecurity risk for many years now. But the biggest change, in my opinion, was just extending this framework to be applicable to businesses of all types, versus this narrow focus of just critical infrastructure. And I think it's very important because it's more of an agnostic framework than very regulatory compliance specific. So it's not HIPAA, FINRA, all of that. It gives you more of a blanket level area to explore where you stack up today as it relates to your compliance and security practices, and then having some ways that you can set targets and then have that gap analysis to go and perform as well. So that's a lot of what I built into this assessment here to give you some guidance. So let's go ahead and dive into that now so you can see how you can start using this tool to see how you stack up against the NIST cybersecurity framework. Okay, so this is the self-assessment that I built here. That's free. You can download it off my blog. I'll link that below here. But effectively allows you to perform the self-assessment of how you stack up against the NIST cybersecurity framework and can be leveraged across your customer base. And it also has this Microsoft assessment, which you can use to see what policies and settings as far as security recommendations you've implemented in the Microsoft tenant. And all of those are mapped to particular core functions in the cybersecurity framework and subsequent categories and subcategories as well, just so that you can have that coverage across the framework as it relates to your Microsoft offering too. But if I walk through this here, you have the various tabs that relate to the different functions in NIST, and essentially here you have a way to give yourself a scoring assessment as it relates to these categories and subcategories here. So as an example, we can say the inventories of hardware managed by our organization are maintained. And for us as an MSP, that's asking, what do we use to maintain the life cycle of our hardware? And hardware is broad, but if we think about, managed workstations, you might be using an RMM tool to manage those devices, but you also want to think about the ways in which you manage the life cycle. So do you onboard devices by imaging them? Do you use autopilot? Do you enroll them in Intune? What does that look like for you? And that's some of the policy definition that I've been talking about that you really want to have documented so that you can move laterally across your organization, but also across your customer base in implementing these policies as well. So the actual scores that you see here, as far as your score today, your 6-month target, 12-month target, are based off of a derivative of the CSF tiers. And I've linked that here so you can see them if you're not familiar. But I want to simplify that even further for this assessment just to make it a little bit more relatable to this space. But effectively here, it's a 1 through 4 scoring system where you say, hey, our organization doesn't do this today at all. So not likely that you don't do the hardware piece today, but there may be some of these, like the vulnerabilities and assets are identified, validated, and recorded. Maybe you don't do that today. Maybe it's very ad hoc, that type of situation. Partial saying that, we do this, but it's very ad hoc in nature. We have some reporting, but it's really inconsistent. We maybe do that when we do have incidents versus trying to have proactive reporting, things like that. And then covered means that we have a policy definition in place. This is how XYZ MSP, performs this particular control or covers this particular function in this area. But, you may not have this actively reported on, or you don't have, a review process in place. So that's covered. You try to implement that. But if you said, do you have 100% compliance across your customers or in your business? You may not know because there might be drift, there might be deviations that you hadn't really thought about that aren't documented. And then the last one here is just automated. And automated is kind of a blanket term, not only to say that, we've implemented this, but we automate it in a regular basis, like your asset inventory. As an example, do you automate the discovery of new assets coming onto the network? As a clear example of looking at hardware. And then do you report on it actively? And do you have a formal review process in place? That's like kind of the highest standard you want to try to achieve where it's applicable. You might not be able to automate everything, but you can at least review that and have some reporting in place to know that you've covered those protections and your policies that you've implemented are being controlled not only at your MSP again, but across your customers. So this is a statement here, or example, just kind of showing you an example of that. And fundamentally, you're just trying to say what is the most accurate. You may have like a little bit of ambiguity between these, but choose, the lesser of both. If you get into that situation saying, if you think you're in the middle of partial and covered, go with partial, because you want to start off with a lower standard and set some goals to get that into a really good state as far as having a lot of confidence that this isn't a covered result as well. So when we talk about using the results, I have the Power BI report that you can leverage, which we'll get into here in a minute, which is automatically updated based off of your assessment here. But then with the Microsoft assessment, what we're doing as you begin to fill all of these out, you'll get the roll-ups here of the averages, which is really dictating, this chart, this radar chart here, as far as seeing where you plot today and where you want to plot in the next 6 months, 12 months, and then your long term. This is, if we get everything done, this is what we would like to be at from that particular stage. But this averages page here is going to give you this recommended tier. And I did that because if you look at this Microsoft assessment, there's like 150 plus controls that I recommend that you implement, and that's overwhelming. And depending on your maturity level across these various areas, you want to know, where can we start today? So what policy should we really begin to prioritize in that sense? And so you could even toggle this down by what tier you're in and just see the policies in that area. And that allows you a way to just kind of say, these are the ones we're going to go look at as well from that perspective. This actually has all the definitions of the columns of what I mean by that if it's ambiguous in any way. But effectively here, this is the control name. This is the offering as in what suite offering it's a part of. You can put priority on this. It's a drop down. You have your base license requirement. I basically just bundled this into the high level offerings as far as the base plans. Just because if you get into all the offerings, it gets way more into the weeds. I do have that in my ebook, but I also you can use the MAPS website to see what subsequent offerings contain that. You have your statuses here, that map up to the reporting as well. So do we have a policy written for this? Is this scheduled? Is this in progress? Did we implement it? Is it automated? Do we not meet the license requirement, or is it not applicable? Maybe because we're using a third-party tool, to cover this particular control. So this is all going to come back to our Power BI report. And again, you can use this both for yourself and as an assessment for your customers. You can use the same scoring system for your current and target score as well. So we may say, in this case, we've written a policy for this particular control, which is devices are monitored and reviewed in Entra, but we haven't automated that. It's kind of more of a manual review today as far as what we do. We don't report this to the customer. We don't formally maybe review this at this point in time. And then a justification is like either assuming risk here, as in we're not implementing this and we're just saying that assume risk, or it's covered by a third party. A good example of that is if I say you should use the Windows update rings in Intune for patching devices. Well, most of us as an MSP aren't doing that in Intune yet. We're actually using our RMM tool to do that. So that's a use case where you'd say, hey, this is covered by a third party, but I'm going to add my RMM tool here, and that can flow up into our Power BI report as well. These next three here I've defined, but there could be variants depending on the customer environment, right? So end user impact, I'm making certain assumptions, for the base level or majority of people who go through this, but depending on the customer, they may have a higher impact than others. And then the level of effort, again, thinking about, is this something that takes you a lot of time, or you have to have a lot of considerations versus an on-off switch that gives you blanket level protection. Security impact, again, depending on the customer environment. Device control category, this is just kind of bucketized to see what your coverage looks like. We'll see that in the Power BI report against the different high-level functions, when we think about security, just to give you a little pulse when we talk about multi-tenancy, where you maybe lack security or compliance today across your customers. And then from the other tabs that we have in here, we have a ransomware profile. This isn't something I built. It was just on another one of NIST resources here, but I thought it was cool because it gives you kind of some examples of where these subcategories and categories come into play as far as a real life example. And I did the same thing here by mapping it to the MITRE techniques or tactics as well, and giving you some examples of real life exploits and things like that, just so you can see that as well too. So all that's kind of encompassed, within this self-assessment. And again, this is something that you can download directly off of my blog. If we pivot here, I also bundle this in. You can use that assessment and then use that to connect to Power BI. So you can actually use this as a template here for both multi-tenant purpose or a single tenant purpose as well. And this will display kind of some heat maps and your target and current profiles, as well as it relates to the NIST core functions. And effectively here, I have things like the current and target NIST profile by customer as more of a heat map, where if your customers are up here high and to the right, that's really a better assessment. They're in a more mature state than customers that are down here in the far left corner as well too. And obviously you're going to have more than 4 customers most likely, but I just want to put some sample data together to show you what this could look like. This is more of a heat map of your coverage. So we're saying, hey, based off of what we've implemented in these categories, we're doing really well, maybe in email coverage, but our application security is really kind of poor right now across all of our customers. You can dive into the various different core functions here to see where you stack up against. And this is clickable. So we're in the identify section right now as far as our averages goes, and you can pivot into things like protect and detect as well too. And then you have your trends and profiles and scores over time. I'm going to show you this here in a second. But basically, you're probably not, a lot of you are probably not in a state where you can do this assessment every month. This might just be every quarter. But effectively, I built it so that with the assessment, you can put in the client name, you can put in the date period, and then you have that also to map within here. So you can see how your customers are trending and kind of monitor that as well. And then for Microsoft, you can see kind of where you have the best coverage across customers and what percentage of controls that you've completed in that customer environment. So it goes all the way from I'm doing really good in Exchange and PowerPoint, not really doing much, in Purview. That's an area that I'm lacking today. And for a lot of us, this will look pretty mirrored, I would think, because a lot of us have put in a lot of Exchange controls. We're getting better at Entra. We're just getting started in Intune for a lot of us, but Defender's maybe not there. OneDrive might be a little bit higher than this example for you. But then you can also see more of a heat map of the percentage of controls complete. So Nova Coast is definitely, kind of in that darker category. And again, you'll have a lot more customers likely in here, but this is just another example of that. And then you are able to switch into more of a single tenant view to see more granular detail on a tenant in general. You have this drop down here, which will list all of your customers that are applicable. And then you can see things like, more of a radar chart for your current versus target scores across those high level bucketed categories. You can see the core NIST functions. You can see how that relates as far as gauges in this particular case. And you can see that heat map across all of the categories in the NIST core functions as well. And then from there, when we talk about the Microsoft controls, you can see kind of what percentages you've completed across the different suite offerings. You can see across, the different functions in the NIST cybersecurity framework, how many policies that you've automated versus, you don't meet the license requirement versus implemented versus in progress. And you can subsequently, see that across those tiers that I mentioned as well too. So kind of just pivoting between, looking at more of, again, color-coded heat maps to give you a better view. And this is where you have all of those compliance controls as well. And you can kind of filter between, is the user impact high? One thing as an example you might want to do is saying like level of effort's low, impact to the user's low, security impact's high. That would be a good use case where you want to kind of filter in on just those. As an example, and you do have kind of the license requirement filter here as well too. When you click on some of these visuals, you'll notice that everything updates accordingly. So you can see that this will kind of just relate back to whatever you filtered in this case, and that relates all back to the report as well. So as it relates to setting up the Power BI template, you will have either, a file path if you're using the single template example, or you will have a folder where you're having, all of your assessments across all customers listed here. And the basic thing is you're just giving this a name that relates to, in this case, the customer name, and then when you did the assessment, in my case, and you can use whatever nomenclature that you want here. But effectively what I built with the Power BI template is that it is compiling all of these files together to see what we just were looking at, as far as that template goes within the Power BI dashboard. And the main difference in those assessments and as far as the Excel sheets goes is that on the averages tab, you're putting in the client name and you're putting in the assessment date. And then in the Microsoft controls, you have two other categories here, columns that this is again the client name and the assessment date. So that's what allows us to kind of have that multi-tenant view again in Power BI. When you download the resources from me, I give you a whole instructional sheet here to show you how to implement the Power BI template for your environment. But effectively here, if you don't already use Power BI, you can download it, and for a lot of us, it could be part of our licensing model already. And then when you open the template that I provided there, it's going to give you a prompt to say, what is your file path for either the folder that you have with all your customer environment assessments, or if you're using the single tenant one, just the file path of that assessment so that you can build that into the report. If for any reason you don't get that prompt or it's giving you some error messages here about not being able to load, you can always go to this transform data button here and click on transform data, which will pull up this new window here. And within here, you're going to have this parameter called folder path or file path if it's a single tenant one. And this is the direct file path, where I have those sample customers as well too. So this is basically, again, grabbing that folder path to be able to query. You do not want to modify any of the column names that I put in there or anything like that, because that will break the report. If you do that, you could add new ones if you really wanted to, and then use that as part of modifications to the template itself, kind of forking it off, if you will. But you do not want to modify that, or else you'll get errors here, and that's really beyond the level of troubleshooting that I put into the guide, just because I think you want to stay close to just the assessment here. So once you've imported that, the data will update accordingly, and you can go ahead and refresh the data at any time here as well. And then you can publish this report to be facing online into a workspace within your Power BI environment. And that's how you're going to be able to monitor that over time. Okay guys, that's everything I have for you today. Definitely check out those resources below in this video. You can download a copy of that assessment tool and the mappings, as well as looking at that Power BI template. So also leave any comments that you had about the video or what you're doing today to map out security and compliance across your customers. As always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content around Microsoft 365 and the MSP space. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week.